This video is going to talk about how Napoleon went from a general in the Revolution to Emperor of France. Napoleon was a product of the Revolution. Before the Revolution, only nobles could be generals, but the Revolution really took away all those titles and things based on money, and it allowed someone like Napoleon, who was a very talented general, especially in artillery, to be able to rise through the ranks to the top of France through military successes. So Napoleon started off as an artillery officer, but he quickly showed himself to be a very talented one. And he was chosen to eventually lead the French army. One of his successes was something called the whiff of grape shot. This is where he shot on some royalist protesters who were on the steps of the National Convention and were protesting the revolution. Now, he used the word whiff of grape shot, which sounds kind of nice, almost like a smell of grapes. But in reality, that's actually shooting and killing protesters. So it shows you how brutal it could be. He was also famous for something called the Siege of Toulon, which was a British-held port in France during the Revolution, one that they had taken over in the revolutionary battles. And Napoleon, despite all odds, was able to cleverly use artillery to force the British out of Toulon. And this led to him getting a lot of credit for that. And from there, he was chosen to be part of the Directory, which was the government that took over after the death of Robespierre. So given that Robespierre had kind of ruled France as a dictator, the government decided that they would divide the power into 5 people, hoping that this would prevent one person from taking over and acting like a king. So Napoleon was chosen, but unfortunately it eventually did not work that way. He eventually took over. So because of his military successes, he was made the French commander of the army in Italy. And here he promised the Italians that he would free them from their Austrian overlords if they went over to the French. And he promised them this, and they did, because they were wanting to get rid of the Austrian Empire. They weren't a country yet. But in reality, he stole art and a lot of money from them and didn't fulfill his promises at all. Then Napoleon went to Egypt. He was eager to get this colony away from the British, again, for lots of riches and art and a good place to trade with India. And he was able to easily crush the Egyptian army. But in something called the Battle of the Nile, Napoleon was not successful in defeating the British, who had a really strong navy and were able to crush his navy. He abandoned his army and went back to France. But that didn't seem to actually take away from his popularity, and here he was able to finally crush the Directory and become what was called First Consul of France, which is a former Roman title that effectively makes him the dictator of France now. People didn't seem to care, though. They were happy because he was doing lots of changes in France. One thing he did was he widened the roads of France. This was actually so he'd be able to quickly get his military around. And it was different compared, if you look at this picture, these are roads in Britain, which are quite narrow. And even today it was helpful that Napoleon did this. Another change he made was he made a lot of canals in France. This was to hopefully make France easier to trade because you could get products from the ocean into the interior of France in a cheap way. This is much cheaper than trying to get things by horse and cart. The next huge change Napoleon brought in was a unified law code. What a unified law code means is all the same laws apply to everybody in France despite your rank and despite where you live. This seems normal to us because that's the case in Canada for as long as we know. But in France, prior to the Revolution, you had different laws depending on where you lived and what your rank and title were. So you could be put to death for something in one region of France and just have a fine for it in another. And so Napoleon said, you know what, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen made us all equal, and the law code should treat us equally too. So he brought in laws for property and protection of property, and they all applied to France. Unfortunately, even though this law was good for many, it was not good for women, who he made under the control of their husband, same with their children. And they had to they couldn't own property, they had to ask their husband's permission for everything. And this was likely because he was mad at his wife, Josephine. Another major thing Napoleon did was kept the price of bread low. We know why they would want that after the French Revolution. So bread had to be a certain price, and you couldn't go above that or risk paying a fine. So he was very popular for this measure because that had been kind of the primary concern of the French Revolution. Another thing he did is he put tariffs on products coming from other countries, particularly Britain. Britain was in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll learn about in a few weeks, and their products are cheaper and better, but he made them more expensive so French people would want to buy them. Except, of course, this did not apply to Napoleon himself. He would only buy British boots for his army because they were the best in the world. Another major thing Napoleon did to change France is he brought in a public high school system in elementary. So now school is free for all children, and it is the law to send your child to school. And he has scholarships for people to go on to university and attend good high schools. This makes sense because this is the way Napoleon rose, was through education. He made a lot more universities. For example, this is the L'École Militaire in downtown Paris. He didn't make this one, but he did allow scholarships to let everybody attend it. And he made a lot more universities around France in general, and technical schools as well. He also enhanced education by filling the Louvre with a lot more art. Now, mind you, this was stolen art from Italy and Egypt mostly, but as well as other places, but it allowed people to have access to art. After all these changes that Napoleon made to France, he was so popular that he was actually able to get rid of the title of First Consul and take on the title of Emperor, which was even a more powerful one. And symbolically, it really linked him to the Roman Empire, which would eventually take over all of Europe. And that's what Napoleon wanted to do as well. So in a very symbolic ceremony, he actually took the crown from the Pope and put it on his own head. In previous ceremonies, the Pope would have done that, but he wanted to show that he truly had the power. He also ordered people who were there to have fun. Napoleon was a bit of an awkward guy and couldn't really host a good party, so he demanded people have fun. And actually, the picture you were just looking at, he had that painted to commemorate it, and that painting is literally the size of the wall of the back of our classroom. That's how big it is, but he really wanted to show off his power. You also see here, he kind of looks like a Roman emperor. He's wearing laurels around his head, almost looks like a king. He wanted to do that to show people he had power. And people are actually okay with this. They were kind of tired of the chaos of the French Revolution, and they wanted a strong person to tell them what to do. And now on to Europe, which he will soon take over, but that will be next week. Thanks for listening.